Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Richard Woolf, who is a local architect. He is and a building historian, so he's done a master's at Cambridge on building history. And does some of this come from that work that you? It does, yeah. And you've given me your CV, your own architectural practice, McDaniel Woolf. We're known for its commercial, community and conservation work, and you're also a member of the Richmond and Wandsworth Council Design Review Panels, which assesses large-scale applications through development control. So fantastic to have you here, Richard. Please welcome Richard Woolf.
Well, thank you very much, and my thanks obviously to Richmond Local History Society for the invitation to present and reflections really on the building history of Ham following our walking tour in June 2023. So I'm very grateful to Paul Bellaway and Robert Smith, and tonight's presentation concludes really the invitation to amble through the building history of Ham, and hopefully, elevate the status of Ham from the bottom of the league table. This ill-defined fragment of West London demonstrates a complex story of urban development. Located 3 miles southwest of Richmond town centre, Ham is a fascinating architectural blend of high-status historic buildings, but very influential 20th and now 21st century civic and domestic architecture. And this presentation, I hope, will weave together a picture of Ham through architecture and building history. I hope to provide a new panorama of this once overlooked but now increasingly vibrant part of the borough, and anticipating the coming decade, I'll explore the evolution of Ham and the implications of the current wave of new construction and civil engineering. And I will examine the role of architecture and contemporary building design predominantly from the end of the Second World War to the present day. Once a preserver of an aristocratic elite, Ham has witnessed transformations over millennia, from Neolithic settlements to Tudor mansions. Building types from the past would have been responding to settlement growth along the Thames over 2,000 years, and these architecturally verified reconstructions of Neolithic and Saxon dwellings share a similar response to the creation of habitation, enclosure and warmth, utilizing local collected materials to create sophisticated dwellings and communal buildings. And many architects who fuse anthropology with their work regard these forms of historic construction as the primordial basis for design, a shared human need for enclosure and the primitive hut. One building which has been subject to a previous presentation for the Society is this late 16th century Tudor manor farm, a reconstruction here presented from the collection down at Wealdon Downland. Its demolition in 1954 marked a tragic loss of what was a building of national importance, and its previous site, which you see at the bottom, is now open land in the centre of Ham. From rural pleasure garden as depicted by Roke's much-referenced survey of 1746 to the site of industrial dereliction and reconstruction, Ham has experienced a 21st century intensification alongside large-scale infrastructure projects to protect water provision for this capital and future flood defence for London. In Roke's survey, we see the noble houses and estates of Ham and Petersham. They're either identical or remarkably similar in architectural style, material and construction, and they vary to suit the site, but always in the fashion of the monarch's chosen architecture. In this case, as you see from Ham House through to Sudbrook House, a continuation of the Jacobite and Stuart architecture of Ham House, evolving into Dutch William and Mary Grand building through the Baroque to a much calmer Palladian classicism. And the prominence of these older buildings should not obscure the innovation of recent. And in Ham, we see a unique wealth of 20th and 21st century buildings. It's a blended example of social and private housing, rich in experimental architecture of global importance. One problem that we all face is defining Ham. It's establishing its geographical extent, and this map indicates various boundaries. We have the three parish churches of St. Peter's, St. Andrew's and St. Richard's. They're the hashed elements. The municipal boundaries between Richmond and Kingston, and also I've put in Wandsworth, whoops-a-daisy, let's go back a bit. I've put in Wandsworth and Merton, which bound some of the further extents of the old tithe areas of Ham. And the current Petersham, Richmond, Riverside and wards electoral boundaries, that's indicated in the pink. So that's actually the boundary that's used when we vote at the elections. But I've also put in the historic boundary of the disbanded Ham District Council, and that you'll see indicated in the hatched orange. Ham District Council was a local government body active from 1894 until 1933, and it was split and subsumed between Richmond and Kingston. And that's the area that effectively went into the ownership and management of Kingston. Let's have a quick look. Here we go. So, the geographical area I propose as Ham, this is my proposition, blends those various boundaries but responds to recent decades of development. To the north and the west, it's clearly bounded by the Thames. To the east, the axial route from Ham House down to Richmond Park. And then further east and then south, I'm going to suggest that there's an uneasy boundary within Ham and Kingston, an area which I think was never particularly well resolved when the Ham District Council was split. And I believe that culturally there is an embrace of Ham in this particular area as well. And if we go back to 1929, this decorative tourist map illustrated by Heather Perry for London Transport in 1929. It highlights rail and bus routes, encouraging visitors to a new area in West London for recreation. Ham is represented by its churches, 4 pubs, parkland, golf courses and open space, including Ham House, and the virtues of its fine avenues and trees linked to Twickenham by a ferry. An amenity space which, almost 100 years later, are still much enjoyed by a greater number, as we can see from this tourist map at Ham House. But the tourist poster hides one reference at odds with the Arcadian landscape. Here they make Trojan cars, which is reference back to this titanic building, now demolished, built between October 1917 and April 1918. I'll repeat that. Within 20 weeks, this building was built to serve the First World War need for munitions and planes. It was built by the Ministry of Munitions, the Great Richmond Road factory. It's one of 3 huge national aircraft factories to supply the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War with aircraft. As I said, constructed in 20 weeks, it was leased by the Sopwith Aviation Company of Kingston with a combined workforce of 3,500. Manufacturing Sopwith fighter planes, which we see from these interior views, only active for 24 months and disbanded at the end of the First World War, the factory was later sold to Leyland Motors for truck manufacture and then subsequently reverted back to aerospace use with the Hawker Aircraft Company of 1948, before finally closing in 1992 and being redeveloped from a brownfield munition site into housing. And what I find absolutely remarkable about this, this building is the fact that, placing the National Aircraft Factory in context to the building history of Ham, that during the First World War, this informative picture, which was taken a little later, of the Greenwood family tending their flower crop, is taken literally a few meters or a few hundred meters away from that Titanic factory, facing this way across what was still open farmland. I'd now like to turn to social housing in Ham. Perceptions of social housing originate as a philanthropic or community response to need. Community and social dwellings commenced really with medieval farmhouses for the relief of financial hardship. The model towns constructed by 18th century Georgian industrialists, or welfare movements promoted by Victorian bankers with companies like the Peabody Trust, Guinness or Rowntree. I'll be limiting the building history of social housing in Ham from 1918 onwards. Previously, housing provision was seen purely as a private and entrepreneurial endeavour. This is the Right Honourable Sir Christopher Addison, the first Viscount Addison, and he was president of the local government board, a member of David Lloyd George's Liberal government of 1916 to 1922, and he was tasked with post-war housing provision. George V's King's Speech in April 1919 captured a prevailing national mood. This is the King. If a healthy race is to be reared, it can only be reared in healthy homes. If drink and crime are to be successfully combated, decent sanitary homes must be provided. If unrest is to be converted into contentment, the provision of good houses may prove one of the most potent agents in this conversion. In the closing years of the First World War and in the months immediately following the armistice, fears of real or imagined social unrest, or even the spread of Bolshevism in Britain, gradually persuaded all political parties of the urgent need for social reform. A massive housing program with standards greatly in excess of those before the war came to be seen as the most important part of this policy. In this highly charged climate, the conservative orthodoxy of the local government board and even the restraining influence of the Treasury were won over to the acceptance of a state-funded housing program, the ultimate cost of which was unclear at the time. The resulting Housing Act, it is known as the Housing Town Planning Act, etc., 1919, under Christopher Addison, the Addison Act, was the result. And here you see on the right-hand side an image of Sea Mill Garden Suburb constructed in Bristol in 1919, which was the outcome of the first large-scale social housing development post-World War I. Reflecting on long-term implications of the 1919 Act, the Anglo-Irish historian Eugene Byrne wrote, the ideological differences that would come to dominate future Labour and Conservative debates over council housing for decades to come were clear. Labour politicians wanted good housing for all, while Conservatives wanted to encourage home owner occupation. The Conservatives regarded social housing as being just for those who could not afford to buy. The local historian Evelyn Pritchard, for which we are all very grateful here at the local Historical Society, reflected in the year 2000 in the millennia in one of our books on the table here that by 1932 Parliament had decided that the small districts should disappear, the ones that were providing small-scale social housing, and Surrey County Council proposed either that all of Ham should go to Richmond, or that Ham Common and the Old Village to Richmond, and around the motorworks, which I've just shown, that was proposed to go to Kingston. But the second choice won, and Petersham had already been taken into the Borough of Richmond in 1892. And as Evelyn writes, almost immediately, Ham became an area for council development, first by slum clearance in Richmond, then as the main centre for council homes, Ham eventually having 4 times as many social houses as anywhere else in the borough except for Mortlake. The images here are views taken between the walls of the gravel extraction fields and the field layouts. The Earls of Dysart, resident at Ham House, had owned virtually all land and property in Petersham and Ham for 300 years. They derived significant income from their tenant farmers, their leased dwellings, freehold ground rents, and gravel extraction, and continued to buy property well into the early 20th century. This all changed as land ownership radically altered in Ham, and the dispersal of the Dysart estate, having been in rural use for generations and fragmented between small-scale dairy production, livestock, and small market garden activities, the Tollemache family, heirs to the Dysarts, bequeathed Ham House and its garden to the National Trust, and the remaining 350 acres of Ham and Petersham estate were sold at auction in 1949 over 2 days, comprising of 41 residences, a farm, 99 cottages, 4 shops, 2 pubs, and various sand and gravel quarries. This disposal had a profound effect in redistributing ownership and entirely changed the social structure of the area. Many villagers bought the freehold of their houses and cottages, and with the release of so much land, plots suitable for building development were inevitably exploited. The local authority and developers went on to build extensive estates of houses and flats, altering the character of Ham forever. So from an early feudal land ownership, the modern collective governance of Ham commences as the political power of the landed aristocrats diminished, and that point really culminated in 1949. I'd like to compare and contrast building design between land development by Ham Urban Council just prior to its disbandment and that of land developed speculatively in the north of Kingston. And here you'll see 2 building types. On the left, Ham Urban District Council, and on the right, work from Crouch Limited in a Tudor-Beathan style. Both of these buildings were developed within 5 years of each other. Both couldn't be more different. The designs for council dwellings in Ham are the evolution, and these are the 2 building types. They are an evolution of an arts and crafts movement aesthetic, whilst the private housing in Kingston, the world of Merry England, Tudor-Beathan, are much favoured by the speculative developers. As Evelyn Pritchard has recorded, social housing for Richmond Council in the 1930s and onwards, after the Second World War, was focused in Ham. And here we see the extent of council housing and estates up to the 1950s. So what's fascinating here is large pockets of Petersham, as well as the main centre of Ham, and this area towards the Weir, were all developed very, very quickly. This area is still fairly redundant and in a post-industrial position. And here you can see 2 of the main streets. It's Lammas Road, which is somewhere in this area, and then we've got this area here, which is Maguire Drive. If the Addison Act of 1919 marked the start of wholesale government intervention in house building, the Housing Act of the 3rd of October 1980 marked its end. The right to buy for social tenants was a defining policy of Thatcherism, dismantling social housing stock. Estates in Ham, such as Maguire Drive, which are pictured there, built in the late 1940s and early 1950s, were swiftly acquired by their tenants. But these particular buildings were prototypical in construction, with utility over longevity as the objective. They would have ideally provided options for higher density redevelopment at the end of their construction life, had the opportunities not been lost when ownership was transferred. But let us not forget that the Labour government of 1987 dropped its objection to right to buy, and our current social and private housing shortages are in part the outcome of both 1980 and 87. But this highly charged political issue is dangerously straying from my topic. For those of you that have an interest, this is my commercial plug. Most people plug books. I'm plugging a symposium. There is a symposium on social housing in the historic context with the association I'm involved with, Ashby, Association for the Studies of Conservation. Please join us if you have an interest in social housing on the 14th of May. In June 1955, the Architectural Review published a special edition entitled Outrage, in response to the national perception of the creeping mildew of suburban sprawl. In the form of a photographic road trip, an essay from Cumbria to the south coast of England, it recorded the rapid decay of civic pride and the third-rate monoculture of urban planning that had affected most of Britain. An anarchic prophecy of doom, Outrage was written by a polemicist and contrarian, Ian Nairn, who established the term subtopia, a compound word formed from fusing suburb and utopia. To capture a mediocre environmental state, Nairn defined the new built environment as, to paraphrase, neither town nor country, an even spread of abandoned industrial buildings and fake rusticity, a land of fences, traffic roundabouts, car parks, and odd things in fields, created by the amalgam of local authority highway engineers, ministries of the Crown, and a lack of visual responsibility, both corporate and private. 70 years ago, Ham in June 1955 would have personified subtopia on the march. Nairn, if he had come to Ham, would have witnessed here his prophecy of development as, I paraphrase, pockets of land waiting to be mopped up, a careless romp across the countryside, a pattern which is wasteful, dreary, and utterly impractical in a small, crowded country. As new road layouts and social and private housing evolved in the early to mid 20th century, Ham developed random standard estate layouts constrained by ancient cart tracks and quarrying needs, linked together like multiplying bacteria on a petri dish. And here we see a wonderful image taken almost due east over Teddington Weir, looking towards, this will be the soon to be demolished aircraft factory number 2. And here we have Maguire Drive. That is social housing. This is Burnell Avenue, that's private. And then we have some more social housing here. But the way in which it's laid out is effectively wherever the builder started and wherever the drainage engineer laid the drain, that was then the housing that would come. And you can see here the depth and dereliction of most of these are very, very deep pits. These are up to, 7 or 8 meters deep. So massive, massive pits that were still left open. But don't worry, if you would like a little bit of subtopian experience, we've still got quite a lot of it in Ham. And Ham still remains an area of subtopian landscape to this day. The publication of Outrage in 1955 and the general public disquiet on the emerging quality of the built environment changed perceptions on the effectiveness of town and country planning, and paved the way for the establishment of national amenity groups such as the Civic Trust in 1957. And a decade later, the Civic Amenities Act of 1967, designating areas of special architectural or historic interest. To quote Lucy Hewitt on her History of Civic Societies movement, the aim of the Civic Amenities Act was to improve the character of towns and cities, accompanied by the long-standing recognition of the importance of local distinctiveness. The tangible outcome for Ham and adjoining Petersham was the establishment and evolution of conservation areas where planning requirements for modification of existing buildings or demolition or new construction is highly regulated. The friction between contemporary development, specifically housing needs, and reactionary preservation remains central to our perception of the dichotomy between inevitable change or cosy conservation. Almost 60 years since the initial establishment of conservation areas, the debate on the effectiveness of retaining local distinctiveness is still hotly debated. Fortunately for Ham, the proliferation of subtopian housing was arrested with two radical housing schemes in the mid-1950s and a substantial housing estate a decade later. So what I'd like to do now is talk about these three large housing schemes which are private. The first is Parkleys, which is down here to the southeast. Langham House Close, an infill development here off Ham Common, and then the very large Waits estate, which is basically from over on the very edge of what would have been the gravel pit area of Ham. I'll talk about Span first. I think most of you are aware of Span, but for those that aren't, I'll just give you a quick update on, or an introduction to Span. Span was co-founded by the architects Eric Lyons and Geoffrey Townsend. The two had met as students at Regent Street Polytechnic, where Lyons had graduated in 1932. Lyons had enrolled in the evening course whilst working during the day at commercial practices, initially specializing in the boom sector of cinemas, but later, and this is very, very important, with the preeminent modernist Maxwell Fry and the revered Walter Gropius, who worked briefly with Fry in England when Lyons was at his practice, from 1934, part of the émigré German intellectuals of the time, who subsequently headed for America. Walter Gropius was really only active in the UK for about 18 months to 2 years, but his impact was phenomenal. The Richmond connection to Parkleys isn't with Eric Lyons, he was from Balham, but Geoffrey Townsend, who was from Twickenham. A school leaver at 16, Townsend worked as a carpenter with an expertise in restoring timber sash windows, before joining a Hounslow-based architect and as a draftsman working on speculative housing in the Tudor-Beaton style. In 1938, Townsend set up the company Modern Homes in the converted Dome building alongside us here. It was in Richmond town centre that Lyons and Townsend started their first speculative housing project, a row of very distinctive homes facing Kneller Hall in Witton. Taking on any fee-paying projects, furniture, industrial design, or architectural work during the war years, the practice in the immediate post-war period worked on bomb-damaged sites and infill work, which is where the purchase of land in Ham presented itself after the old glasshouse and nursery farm was destroyed during the Blitz. Their work at Parkleys in 1956 was a radical reinterpretation of British domestic architecture, blended with inventive urban planning, mature landscape, and compact housing, and it first saw realization in Ham. Entrepreneurial, creative, financially savvy, and highly innovative, the span formula at Parkleys proved to be a great success. There's a vast amount to say about span and Eric Lyons and the connection with Richmond. Had the Ham initiative failed, post-war domestic housing would have lost a distinctive strand of evolution. Concurrent with the development at Parkleys in 1954, another progressive series of buildings was being constructed literally across the road, a short walk from Parkleys. The recently established practice of Stirling and Gowan, a partnership which flourished briefly for 7 years between 1956 and 63, was redefining an expressive post-war modernity. At Langham House Close, a backland development behind a high-status early Georgian country house fronting Ham Common, a collection of 24 flats in three and two-storey configurations were constructed at precisely the same as Parkleys. Where the architects of Parkleys had developed an English response akin to contextual Northern Scandinavian modernism, Langham Close embraced and developed mid-European aesthetic of cubic raw composition, constructed with a reduced material palette. Now this is very interesting. These are two conceptual drawings, one in the hand of Eric Lyons, that's the upper one, one in the hand of James Gowan, that's the lower one. So take these as it were as the first script. This is the first realization of an architectural intent, and these two drawings were done on two sites literally across the road from each other. On opposite sides of Ham Common are two late 20th century projects built simultaneous and both responding to the spirit of their age, but reaching alternative conclusions. In the hand of Eric Lyons and James Gowan at the top, you can see those two different approaches. So if we go from the conceptual drawings to the final realized buildings, photographs of the finished work are here. At Parkleys, we see a slightly more playful integration between buildings and landscape. We see use of color, materials and site contacts and a more expressionist environment. At Langham Close, a much more muscular, rationalist response, and we see buildings and their method of construction as a sculptural response located on the landscape rather than within the landscape. But both estates are truly unique, revolutionary and prototypical. Both housing schemes represent the first major commissions of two architectural practices who would have a profound impact on British architecture for decades to come, and both are in Ham. I present here an aerial view of Ham taken in 1948 by the RAF, and this is really to set the context for the third of the three housing estates. The sale in 1949 of the depleted gravel extraction works had left the rest of Ham as an industrial wasteland waiting to be infilled from bomb rubble clearance of post-war London. This aerial image is the iconic record frequently published in all subsequent histories of the area, and for good reason. Firstly, the RAF were using large format cameras with exceptional resolution, and secondly, on the day of their flight, cloud cover was minimal. The entire open area indicated on this image was anticipated for wholesale private residential development. So although this area is what is actually going to be realized in the mid-70s, the area and the extent of development was going to encompass all of the gravel pits over to the west as well. The Waits Company of Normanton had published the land and would develop designs with their own architects and deliver the construction. So it's a totally vertical operation. The Waits family were very, very progressive, as you'll see later with the work at St. Richard's. Here is an early promotional brochure and below the completed housing. After the completion of the easterly section of the development, local pressure to retain amenity space saw the anticipated future phases halted. The construction technique used by the Waits Company on infilled land was also innovative. And here we see raft construction of the eastern section of the development, where, just to explain, this is the foundation technique used to support the Waits estate. So it's effectively a load-bearing, a large, broad foundation on soft ground, rather than the standard approach, which is strip foundation, which is what I would say 90% of all houses are built on. The challenge is, as you can see in this picture, that we do have some deflection. It's my view that the backfilling of Ham lands was done in a rather vernacular way. The rate at which the ground is compacted and then becomes stable can take many years. But if you're wanting to rush onto site, you may cut corners, you see. And I think this might be one of those situations there. The estate has matured, and many of the strategies employed previously by Eric Lyons and Spann can be seen in the mature landscaping, which is a striking feature of this estate. I'd now like to move to civic buildings. 100 years ago, Ham and Petersham had 3 established churches. Aristocratic St. Peter's, St. Andrew's, and St. Andrew's, which is late Georgian, and All Saints, a Romanesque folly built in 1909 for a congregation that never materialized. So I'm sure you see this building quite frequently from Richmond Park, but it's really super to go and have a look at it. But this building was built for effectively a housing estate that never materialized, that was going to go here. So fortunately, never consecrated. Now a private residence. These 3 churches follow predictable designs. However, they lack the remarkable architectural inventiveness of the 20th century Ham Parish Church of St. Richard's, completed in 1966. And here you see some early drawings which show the integration of St. Richard's Church, this is the church here, within the Waits estate, and these drawings, we believe, my thanks to Sir David Williams for these, are in the hand of the Waits architect, Stephen Bland. The importance of St. Richard's can't be underestimated. Its unique design is rightly acknowledged, and last year the building was listed Grade 2, a similar status to its sister church, St. Andrew's. Designed in the Star of David plan, the architect Ralph Cavell stated that he wished to provide a one-room church in which the interrelationship between main elements could be adjusted if necessary. He wanted to avoid fixing the main liturgical elements in such a way that they couldn't be altered. So if time goes by, changes he wanted to see could take place. This is a remarkable series of pictures. This is the laying of the foundation stone by Norman Waits. I believe the Waits family actually vested the land to the Diocese of Southwark. And this is the incredible roof structure which we have at St. Richard's. And here is the hyperbolic paraboloid roof, of which there are now very, very few left in the country. This particular roof construction only took place for about 15 years, most of which now have been demolished. So this really is a unique feature. I also rather like this image. So here we have St. Richard's, the emerging Waits estate, and here we see St. Richard's School. The connection here. We believe the school was done by Ralph Cavell as well. And in the background here, you can see that the Ham lands itself slowly maturing, so a lot of this tree cover has taken place in the 30 years since the backfill. Its experimental roof structure is a complicated timber construction consisting of three hyperparabolic paraboloids, hyper shells, sorry, and three pyramidal structures. It defines a single room worship space. So this photograph I think is terrific because this explains this single worship space. Placing the celebrant centrally, so that's the altar rail here and that's the table. A response to the liturgical movement principles initiated by the Catholic Church in the mid-60s and supported by both Anglican and Catholic theologians and architects, looking for a noble simplicity rather than sumptuous display. And here you see the church being used as a civic space with pupils for St. Richard's and the interior of the church as it is now. Currently under assessment for major repairs, it's hoped a timely restoration will be successful for this building. An adjacent building in central Ham is the Woodville Centre, previously the Ham Infant School in 1968. This is a remarkable building, not much recorded, I have to say. It's taken a while to get these pictures, thanks to local history. But it's an optimistic design and could be described as cheerful architecture. It's simply constructed in lightweight steel and timber, and the building has a 20th century abstract sculptural delight with a distinct Scandinavian quality. It currently provides dementia care. I'd now like to turn to the centre of Ham and its evolution after the Second World War up until today. And this is the area under review. So just to orientate yourself, this was St. Richard's Church, and this is the Woodville Centre just to the northwest. This area was successfully used as emergency housing after the Second World War. However, by the 1960s, the natural life expectancy of these prefabs had expired. So that's a view along the prefabbed houses here that stretch all the way to Woodville Road. So all of the original farmland turned over to emergency housing after the Blitz. A new development was proposed to replace the prefabs. The scheme selected by Richmond Council utilised a standard design and build solution where both the architecture, engineering, construction of the buildings would be undertaken by one appointed body, and this was the Wimpey Construction Company of Hammersmith. But just as the prefabricated housing was eventually replaced, 50 years later, the Ham Close scheme was identified for redevelopment, and here we see the area under consideration in 2010. So here's St. Richard's, the Woodville Centre. This is the 1960-62 scheme, which was a design and build from Wimpey. These two buildings were later additions, a health centre and what was called the Ham Community Hall, which then became the Ham Youth Club. This is the original site here of that wonderful, wonderful Tudor manor farm. And Newman House, Cardinal Newman's residence with the blue plaque, and Grey Court School. Enter the King. Enter the King. Invited by Richmond Council and the social housing provider in 2014, the then Prince of Wales architectural charity, the Prince's Foundation, undertook a feasibility study of the area. Two schemes were proposed. One, which is the top scheme, is a crescent retaining open land to the east. The second created a central square with formal orthogonal arrangements of housing in mansion block form, framed at this end by belvedere towers. So I wasn't around when he came, but I can't recall what he said. Does anybody remember? That's later questions. But just to let you know that this is the scheme that was in consideration to replace Central Ham. And those are the visuals. On the left-hand side, we have the crescent scheme with the open ground. And on the right-hand side, we have the large, formal central garden with 5-story mansion blocks and the 2 belvedere towers at the end. For your reference, a completed scheme under the King's control can be experienced at Poundbury in Dorchester, and it provides an indication as to what was proposed for Ham. So there we have the proposals for Ham in 2014, and there we have Poundbury, and you can see here, if I just go back, a very similar architectural approach in a revivalist style. I'm unclear why the King's initiative was abandoned and look forward at some stage to gaining access to documents from that period. Here is the current site layout from the early 1960s, which is being replaced. So for those who aren't plan readers, what we've got here is the Wimpy scheme, and these 2 areas here and here were later filled with the health centre and the community hall youth club. And these are the series of point blocks which were reduced at very short notice, and a series of deck access blocks here. If we now overlay the proposal, which will be and is currently being constructed, what you'll see there is the footprints of the blocks and the phased construction, which also takes in what was previously open land at St. Richard's School. And here is a massing drawing and phase development proposals of what is currently being constructed in Ham. This will be the new community centre replacing the previous youth club. And what we've got is the open area to the east, and then a series of large blocks and standalone 3-story houses. These are visuals of the scheme by the architect BPTW. And the scheme is based upon a scheme which has been built out in Northolt. So the Ham scheme is a modified version of one completed by the appointed delivery partner, the Hill Group in Northolt. And that's where we are at the moment. Construction is underway, completing in 8 years. I would now like, with 10 minutes, to present a final pair of buildings whose history is remarkable. At the turn of the millennium, the Department for Education and Skills under David Miliband launched the Classrooms of the Future initiative. Local education authorities proposed new educational architecture that fused with teaching technology, and 30 pilot projects were selected in England, from Durham to Cornwall. Outcomes of these design concepts were to be trialled, from which would come guidance on best design practice to suit educational investment in the future. Richmond was successful in the bid, and 3 classrooms were to be built, of which 2 were eventually constructed. Both currently reside in Ham. And here you can see the 2 classrooms of the future. That was it on completion, and these were taken last year and earlier this year. The architectural group selected was Future Systems. It was formed by the radical Czech neo-futurist Jan Kaplicki and the English architect David Nixon. considered to be amongst the most influential visionaries of contemporary architecture. Arriving in London in the late 1960s, following the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, Kaplicki established his studio Future Systems with Nixon in 1979. The design is biomorphic, with detailing such as these ventilation and window blind systems appropriated from nautical technology. Adopting a fluid architectural approach known generically as parametric design, the classrooms were manufactured in glass fiber reinforced resins similar to the techniques also used for boat hulls and fabrication. The future of one of these buildings remains unsure as it reaches the end of its beneficial use, and many of you may remember Joe Wicks in one of them. I move now from buildings to civil engineering. And it isn't just buildings which define our environment, it's also large-scale engineering. Ham is currently preparing for a major infrastructure project which will impact the area for many years. The final lasting buildings by the riverside will be by the riverside, and this will show you the zone of interest that the Thames Water have cutting underneath Ham, and these two areas will be, and potentially a third one here, will be access shafts to what will be a titanic piece of below-ground engineering. The overall concept, I'm not an expert as such, the overall concept is to abstract water from the Thames to Lockwood Reservoir, and then to reintroduce treated water from Mogden to make up the shortfall. I'm not an engineer, but these two intake and outlets seem to be remarkably close. Anyway, that's as it be. I'm not an engineer. The final lasting buildings that we will see in Ham will be riverside in nature. I believe the project is an historic continuation of previous hydrology engineering in the 19th century. The image on the right, is the extension of the New River instigated in the Tudor period when London experienced its first water crisis. And now we face another crisis of confidence as the geotechnical surveys begin. So these are the surveys taking place on Ham lands, and this was the demonstration in September 2023. And just to remind us that history is current, this is where we're going with builders or blockers. In conclusion, we've examined how a prehistory settlement evolved and how Ham lost a great Tudor manor. We've looked at how Ham developed philanthropic and public-funded housing to answer social needs. Hopefully, we've seen how Ham became a crucible for emerging Second World War urban housing, both new private and also council. And we're also aware now that Ham will be seeing a new 21st century evolution of higher density housing than it has previously seen. Our village sign records great historic buildings of national importance set within ancient landscape. But that, for me, is not the building history of Ham. I propose that Ham is a new town, if defined as a planned urban centre created in an undeveloped or rural area, especially with government sponsorship. So, let's celebrate the fact and maybe commission a second village sign. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. How fascinating. We've got a few minutes for questions. And will you be able to answer more questions afterwards?
I'd be thrilled. There's so many friends in the audience.
Very lovely.
I'm just wondering who's going to ask the difficult question.
Right. So we've got two roving mics, Simon and Julian. So who'd like to ask the first question? There's a lady at the back, yes.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I wondered... thank you so much. That was so interesting. I wondered actually, Richard, what you like about Ham, because I think you live there. You know, elevator pitch here.
What do I like about Ham? Why have I been so lucky to wash up in Ham, to bring up a family and start a practice and really spend 5 decades? Ever-changing, unpredictable, scruffy, not smug, interesting people, difficult future, new communities emerging, always fluid, always on the move, never dull.
Any more questions? There's another question at the back.
Hi, thank you. Just a quick question. What was wrong with the Wimpy estate that it seemed to have been got rid of?
Very, very good question. What was wrong with it? It was sat on valuable land. It was sat on valuable land. Physically, what was wrong with it? All buildings need to be refurbished. All buildings, I mean, we're working on buildings now that are 300 years old. You know, you can keep anything going if you want. I would say that the decision to redevelop Ham Close was absolutely correct. The estate that had been planned in the 1960s was substandard. What was wrong with the old buildings? Deck access housing, you know, is that really a 21st century solution? But the main issue is that it was sat on 4.5 hectares of prime land that needed to be developed, and the local authority and the social housing provider felt that was the way forward.
There's another question at the back, or two questions there.
Richard, what's happened to the council tenants who bought their houses in the Wimpy estate?
They will be rehoused on a like-for-like basis. So the answer is they are all going to be rehoused, which is a considerable positive outcome. Yes, 143, I believe.
Yes, there's another gentleman.
Thank you very much for that, especially your summing up of why Ham. I would just comment that that tallies with our experience of our children going to Grey Court. It's a series of mixed blessings, but on the whole, blessings. What lessons were learnt from the classroom of the future?
Right. Now, it's the classroom of the future as an architectural construct has sort of sunk without trace. It does need a PhD to wind back and see a post-occupancy review. 3 things were happening with the classrooms of the future. The first is that schools that were in special needs, of which at the time Grey Court was, if any of you remember Grey Court round about 95 to 2005, it was a failing school. It wanted a boost, and I think the Labour government felt that the classroom of the future would give schools a bit of a promotion. The key issue, reading the documents that came out of Miliband's department, is that it was to fuse new technology with new learning techniques, and the environment, the actual classroom, was to be memorable. So you have a situation where the objective was actually a disconnect between the technology and the buildings, because technology can go anywhere, can't it, really? But I have to say that the 2 classrooms of the future that we got in Ham are absolutely world-class pieces of architecture. So if anything, it allowed many people who were considering Grey Court as a potential school to see innovation both architecturally and in terms of technology. What's happened to the other classrooms of the future, I don't know, but if there's a PhD student out there who wants to do a building history about post-occupancy, that's a great topic.
Question there, Simon?
Richard, I'd like your view about two things that I feel strongly about as a Ham and Petersham resident for over 50 years. In Ham and Petersham, we have more open space than anywhere else in Richmond upon Thames, and I would like to have your comment on how we balance the preservation or conservation and improvement of that open space, unique amount of open space, with the pressures of development that you've talked about. The second thing I would welcome a comment on is the new Ham Close development, which I told the architects Ham is a place of low density, low-rise buildings. Please design a scheme which tries to integrate with that. I don't think they've succeeded in that and rather ignored the helpful, I thought, helpful comment. And would welcome your view on that.
Well, thank you, David. If there's anybody who understands Ham and Petersham, it's you. Thank you so much. How do we as a society balance development with amenity and open space? How do we balance between effectively housing and open space? My view is that Ham itself is going through a titanic change. The Ham Close development is substantial. I was there, as many of you were as well, at the Council's Planning Committee meeting, where it was voted through without exception. And I also remember the late, great Martin Ellengorm saying, "This is the dullest scheme I've seen before this committee." I don't know what the answer is, but I certainly know that your work in protecting Ham lands will protect Ham. And you, sir, are very much part of saving those open spaces.
I can see there's a question from Zoom. Sorry, thanks. Thanks, Judy.
We've actually got 3 questions. I don't know whether you want them all together or one at a time.
Maybe, yes, because we're sort of running up. Maybe put them together, yeah.
Put them together. Okay, one is from Andrew George. Why does most of the modern architecture of Ham not relate to the Thames?
Yeah.
Are there plans to improve the transport connections? The shops in Ham appeared to be in scope of the new plan, but then appears to be out of scope later on.
Yes.
Is there an opportunity for a nod to the loss of the earlier farm or barn?
Right. So the first is, why is the architecture in Ham, why does it not address the architecture of the Thames? Well, what is the architecture of the Thames and what is context? You see, when we talk about building in context, what is the context of Ham? You know, it was open green fields, it was then in industrial wasteland, and now it's become a suburb. So if one looks at the aesthetics of buildings along the Thames, do we then design everything to look like Georgian boathouses? Would that be the aesthetics? When we look over at at Teddington Lock towards what was the old boat building yards, and we see that new development, is that Thames architecture? So the answer to the question is, what is context? And if you spend your life designing or reflecting the facadal design of stuff that exists, you end up in a hall of mirrors where nothing's new and nothing's old. The second question is about transport. As we know, Ham has got the lowest PTAL score in Richmond. PTAL being your availability to public transport. There's one road in, there's one road out. Okay, and unless we see substantial big thinking and potentially a connection between Ham and Twickenham, then I'm afraid that the 371 bus will continue to grind its way on that single route in and out. And the final question was about the shops. You're quite right, very well spotted. The original scope for the redevelopment of Ham took in the privately owned block of retail with residential above and Ham Library. That was absolutely in scope and was taken out of scope when the land owned by Richmond Housing Partnership was sold to or vested to the Hill Group.
Great. Well, thank you, Richard, for that very informative, wonderfully informative talk. Could I, as a token of our appreciation, I've got something which I think you asked for, actually.
I did.
Some chocolates.
Chocolates.
But please, thank you.
Thank you very much.